introducing Doctor Who's most iconic villain in the second episode, I like that. I like that a lot, and I'm going to do my best to avoid spoilers for at least a few minutes so as I can get an opportunity to share my thoughts with any of you that have not seen this story before without just spoiling everything, because I don't like spoilers, and the odds are that neither do you. So we open where we left off with the radiation detector reading as danger, and the Doctor and his unlikely companions going off to explore what they presume to be a safe planet. And the first thing that I want to say is that I actually quite like the side of the forest. It looks very different and really interesting, and I just found myself looking around at all sorts of different things and wondering what they were, and not only what they were in terms of how they were made, but also what they were in terms of the planet itself. And I just found myself intrigued with the whole forest, so that was pretty cool. I enjoyed that. And I don't consider it a spoiler to say that the Daleks show up in an episode called The Daleks. So, what did I think of the Daleks in this episode? Well, they actually worked really well for me. And I enjoyed seeing the beginnings of the Daleks in this episode, and seeing how they were first presented, and just the ways that they interact with each other. And it's hard to say how interested I would have been had I not had any prior knowledge of the Daleks from my experience watching New Who and even Classic Who. But I think I still would have found these to be an interesting foe, because just the way that they move around and the way they interact with each other, it's just very interesting. So I'm pretty sure I would have been interested either way, but I was guaranteed to be, at the very least, interested because of my experience with Doctor Who prior to this. So it's just good to see Skaro for the first time in Doctor Who history, and this idea that the Daleks are powered by the floor is a new one to me, but I found it quite worked for this story and what they needed it to do, and it just worked. And I did like the scene when they were trying to figure out how they got their power, and they worked it out piece by piece, and they just kind of figured things out, and that was really entertaining and fun to watch. But yeah, I really do think the Daleks were an effective and intimidating presence in this episode. I was never scared by them, per se, but they were effectively intimidating to our protagonists of the story. And I also think that they showed us the Daleks at just the right point in the story. Like, they didn't wait too long, and they didn't bring them in too early. I think that when they showed us the Daleks was the right moment, so it was a good decision on their part. I also like what I've seen and heard of the TARDIS so far, and there are some things that are just foreign to me, as well as some things that are very familiar, and I didn't mention this in the previous video, but I really like how the TARDIS sound really hasn't changed at all in almost 55 years. I just like that a lot. And also the fault locator is an interesting bit in the TARDIS, which is new to me. And for a 7-part story, pacing is gonna be a pretty big deal. And I think this episode moved really efficiently, for the most part. Most of part 6 was unnecessary, and could have been cut almost entirely. That whole bit in the cave, I did find parts of it interesting, and overall it was interesting, but also overall it didn't have a huge impact on the story, and you could have breezed by that, and it wouldn't have really mattered. In fact, it would have made the pacing feel better, and it would have just made everything move a little bit faster, and it wouldn't have taken that dip in part 6, which to me, it definitely did. I don't consider the Thals to be a spoiler, really, considering how early they show up and their level of involvement. It's not exactly a big reveal, considering that anyone watching this in chronological order, without any other knowledge, doesn't even know who the Thals are yet. I mean, it's not like that major spoiler for Series 10 that we all got months in advance, or 2 spoilers actually, depending on how you look at it. Yeah, it was 2 spoilers. But anyway, so far as their level of involvement, I think they worked just well enough for me in this story. Also, the information about the mutations and them coming full circle was an interesting bit of information to have. The Thals were a necessity for the story we were being told. And while I wasn't as interested in them as, say, the Daleks, I did think that in being there, the Thals served a legitimate purpose. And they were successfully integrated into the story. What the episode has also very effectively done is gotten me to really question my relationship with Susan, and how I feel about her as a character. Previously, I hadn't been too keen on her, and although I did actively want her to succeed and to shine, from the start of this episode, I just started liking her. I started liking her quite a bit. I really started to enjoy her enthusiasm and her positivity and just sheer awe at wonders and at things that she was excited about. It reminded me kind of the wonder that I'm used to seeing from the 10th Doctor. You know, when he would just see something and it would just make him say, "Oh, brilliant." And I just loved seeing the joy in his eyes and enthusiasm, and I felt as though I got some of that through Susan. And the thing is that this wasn't completely sustained. There were times when I found that I just wasn't into the character of Susan. This had to do with how she tends to freak out at the small sense of danger, and scream, and just generally overreact, and be a bit too over the top for my taste. Not insofar as me getting actively annoyed at her, but enough that I would get a little taken out of the story, and it was essentially for the same reasons as in the first episode. But the thing was that, in this episode, I found things that genuinely made me kind of love Susan. Not totally love, but kind of love. But that was also mixed with these things that I just didn't like. Now, this is all well and good, and we can just understand that my current relationship with Susan is complicated, and we can move on. Except for one thing. One pretty big thing. Now, the remainder of what I'm going to discuss for the next several minutes, I'm going to classify as light spoilers, because it shares a couple of beats of the story that doesn't really give enough way to ruin it whatsoever, but it will lead you on as to what is in this episode. So, with that out of the way, during the scene when our four characters are trapped in the room by the Daleks, the Doctor is unconscious, Ian's legs are paralyzed, Barbara is just feeling very unwell, and Susan is very fearful of going to get the drugs, because, well, she's afraid. And Barbara says a line during that scene that made me rethink my entire understanding of Susan as a person. Barbara says, "You can't let her go alone. She's just a child." And that line made me realize something that previously I just hadn't for some reason. Susan is a child. Susan is a child stuck in a frightening situation where she is afraid for herself and the lives of her friends, and she has been given a great deal of responsibility. She is afraid of failing. She is afraid of dying. She is afraid. And that was something that I had failed to realize, because she had been set up as such a mysterious person in the first part of An Unearthly Child. And when I saw her get so terribly frightened and scream all the time, it was honestly disappointing to me. And while I do feel that they overplayed their hand on that aspect, I will admit I did find her character lacking to me. And I didn't find her particularly complicated or investing, but I wasn't viewing this character as a child. I was viewing her as an alien and a time traveler who has a lot of experience traveling through time, partially from my future knowledge of this show, but also because of how she was set up in the first part of An Unearthly Child. And I really just don't think that was to her benefit. But after having made that realization, and now having a far better understanding of Susan as a person, I just kind of get it. I think she's really far more out of her element than I had initially realized. And now this doesn't mean that I'm completely sold on Susan, but I am more understanding. And I really am more forgiving of how she acts. But I still don't like watching her scream frantically. But I'll admit that understanding her better, it is a lot easier to get invested in the scenes when she panics and doesn't have full control or understanding of the situation that she is in. Now, here's what I really want the show to do with Susan. At this point in the show, she is an inexperienced and frightened child. But the operative words here are "at this point." I would absolutely love it if we get to see Susan grow and learn, and become more aware and calmer to her surroundings. I want Susan to, rather than see a Dalek and scream frantically, see a Dalek and try to find the best way to deal with the situation at hand. I want Susan to shine and to be smart and savvy enough to be able to save those around her and get everybody out of the difficult situation, rather than panicking and leaving most everything to everyone else, and also hampering those that have to save her. I will ultimately be disappointed if she doesn't grow at all. And I hope the show doesn't miss the opportunity. Or didn't, because this was almost 55 years ago, and anything that they did was a long time ago, so it wouldn't be missing an opportunity in the future tense, but rather missing an opportunity in the past tense. But I think you understand what I mean. So, as I have just spent a good deal of time talking about Susan, let's move on to Ian. Ian. Where do we begin with a guy like Ian? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Ian, just like I said previously, always seems to need to take charge of every situation and do everything himself, even when it makes absolutely no logical sense. In that same scene I was talking about earlier, the one where one of the group has to go collect the drugs, Ian, for some reason, seems to think that he needs to be the one to do it. Of the four of them, Ian is the least capable, with the fourth least capable only going to the doctor because he's not even conscious at the time. It's pretty obvious that either Susan or Barbara should go, and due to the fact that Susan just seems to be less affected by the radiation at this point, and also the whole thing with the lock melting if you turn the key wrong or whatever, something to that effect. And the only reason he might get any leeway from me is considering that Susan is a frightened child. But even considering that, she has to be the one to do it. It only makes sense, and it is apparent from the beginning of the scene that he feels he needs to be the one to do this. So honestly, I can't be too forgiving to Ian. Yeah, I don't hate Ian, but something needs to change, or there needs to be some sort of explanation and a way that we can better understand this character, because currently there are too many situations where I just have to question his judgment. I especially question said judgment considering the scene in which he was going to warn the Thals that the Daleks were dangerous, but he took forever doing absolutely nothing, which I just didn't understand. Why did he wait so long? He could have saved more lives. I think Ian just should have showed up like 30 seconds later than he did in that scene, and that would have fixed the whole problem for me, because then you can still have the Thals get killed, and then you can still not have Ian seem like an idiot, you know? And there is, however, one quote from Ian that I really liked, where he says, "Pacifism only works when everybody feels the same." And this isn't something that's new to me. It is something I find to be true, and for the purposes of this story, it works quite well. And I promise this is the last thing about Ian, but the scene with the Thals, where he is trying to convince them that they need to use aggression, plays really well. And even though he is doing some rude things, it serves the purpose of the story, and I found the whole scene rather interesting. And just the escalation, to the point where that one Thal, I don't remember the name of, but the one Thal hits Ian, and I really enjoyed that. The scene where Ian controlled the Dalek was an interesting scene, especially for my experience with New Who, and it reminded me of, obviously, anyone that's seen this episode and that episode instantly made the connection, but the Series 9 premiere, and it's interesting to know that Moffat didn't just make that up, and it was actually something connected to the classic series, and I promise that is the last thing about Ian. Moving on, now, in the last episode, I made a prediction. I made a prediction that the radiation going into the danger zone would have absolutely no impact on this episode whatsoever. I thought it was going to be a cheap cliffhanger to get viewers to come back the following week. I'm honestly going to have to eat my words on this one, because I was wrong. I was so very wrong. Not only did the radiation influence the plot, but it was one of the driving elements in the first couple of episodes and remained an important piece for all 7. So this is the time when I am forced to openly admit that I was just wrong. Plain and simple. And good job to the writers on connecting the episodes together more so than I believed that they actually would. I enjoy the small amount of connective tissue. It's not a big deal, but it definitely means something to me. It's definitely worth at least touching on Barbara in this video. I like her. It's interesting to see her out of her element and struggling with the scenarios she is put in. She still feels like a well-realized and grounded individual, and she's easily my favorite of the companions. I don't have any complaints, really. I think she's been playing well in this show, and I like what she brings to it. I don't think she overdoes the dramatics. I think she does a very good job, honestly. I quite like Barbara. No complaints. But to me, the most interesting character in the group has to be William Hartnell's portrayal of the Doctor. He is definitely very interested in exploring and learning more about the places they go to, and just investigating things he doesn't know much about, which seems to be very little. And he definitely feels as though he knows a lot about a lot, and I just find his interactions with other characters amusing at times, and the way he is somewhat dismissive or a little confused at someone's strangeness. And sometimes he's a little bit bitter for my taste and a little mean-spirited, but hopefully he comes around in time. Well, obviously, eventually. I'd just like to see some steps made with William Hartnell's Doctor. Not leaps per se, but at least steps toward making him a less mean-spirited Doctor. Also, I found it pretty crazy that the Doctor lied to his accidental companions by making up a fake accident with the ship and claiming that they would have to get Mercury from the planet just so that he would have a chance to explore it for himself. That definitely put them in a dire circumstance, and it was entirely on the fault of the Doctor. And I was interested by that because that is not a side of the Doctor that I am used to seeing commonly at all. I've said a good amount about this episode, and I honestly think that's about it. I quite enjoyed the first story with the Daleks. The Thals were an effective addition to the already intimidating Daleks. Susan proves to be a complicated character I can't make up my mind on yet, at least, so far, and I desperately want her to grow and shine. Ian is just too much, and while he's not known to me yet, I have little hope for his future as a companion. I genuinely like Barbara and am eager to see more of her in following episodes. The Doctor proves to be an interesting character I am eager to see more of and hope to see the softer side of soon, at least just a little. I did enjoy this one more than the first episode, and although a somewhat unnecessary 6th part, this story still earns a strong rating of 8 out of 10. If you join me this coming Sunday, I will be diving into The Edge of Destruction, the much shorter follow-up episode. I can't actually make any predictions for this one because I've already seen it, but I'm honestly pretty eager to talk about it, and sometimes I might get a little bit ahead of schedule watching these episodes just to make sure that I can stay on top of these weekly reviews, which I plan to do for, hopefully years, a while. Anyway, thank you for watching, and let me know what you thought of this episode down below. I hope to see you again next Sunday. Now take care, and have a lovely week.
That's it? Dodgems!
So, anyone for Dodgems?